for the Climate Risk for Coastal Transportation Infrastructure Community of Practice. Today we have the privilege to have Nicky Hastings from the Geological Survey of Canada as our presenter. Nicky will talk today about how can Canadian coastal communities understand and mitigate against coastal flooding. Before I hand it over to her, I just want to briefly introduce her. So Nicky is the project lead for the Risk Project in the Public Safety Geoscience Program at Natural Resources Canada. Over the last 10 years, she has been involved in development and adaptation of risk assessment methods to support assessment of earthquake and flood risks in Canada. She has worked closely with both local and provincial government to understand how scientific knowledge from natural hazard risks can be incorporated into decision making. And she currently manages a small research team that focuses on implementation and development of open source risk assessment tools for earthquakes and floods. Before I hand it over to Nicky, I just want to let you know that if you have any questions during her presentation, please write them down in the question box, and I'll make sure to ask our presenter at the end of the session. So thank you everyone for being here. And with that, I'll hand it over to Nicky.
Good morning and good afternoon for those of you across the country. So I'm based in Vancouver, so it's morning here. And thank you, Sophie, for that nice introduction. So let me just get started. So I just want to say that the work I got involved in started a couple of years ago when a colleague of mine, Tom James, came up to me and he had been working on sea level rise projection work across Canada at a national scale. And he asked me, can you take this work to the next stage to start to understand who and what are impacted across the country from sea level rise and to start to understand where those areas of concern might be? So, and he knew that our team had been working on developing models to estimate losses from earthquakes and from flooding events. So, you know, I took it back to our team and we accepted the challenge and said, how can we move forward on this? And I'm just going to advance the slides. Just give me 1 minute. Okay, hold on a second. I might have to get my assistant to help me.
Hey, Nicky, just try using your keyboard arrows now to advance.
Okay.
Excellent.
There we go. Okay, thank you. So, so there we go. So okay. So his team had been, and some of you may be familiar with the map that I'm showing on the screen right now. So his team had been working with some colleagues over a number of years to develop what's called this climate coastal sensitivity map. And it shows areas of concern that will be impacted from a changing climate. So it takes in together a number of factors, including the wave climate, the changing sea level, slope impacts, coastal materials that vary across the country, impacts from tide ranges, changes to the changing sea level ice and ground ice as well. So this was kind of our starting point. But what I realized, we stepped back and said, well, we have a sense of areas that are of concern, but how do we understand who and what can be impacted? Because in some cases, in some of these areas, there are not very many people living, or there's not a lot of infrastructure, so how do we get a better understanding from the 35 million people across Canada who and what are exactly implicated? And so we stepped back and put together a team of people. And what you're looking at the screen right now is a core research team that we put together over the year. And we recognized that even within our own organization that we had a number of experts who are already working on some of these coastal issues across the country. So we pulled together some of our colleagues from within the Geological Survey of Canada, and then reached out to some of the other federal departments who are also working on some of these coastal issues. So you can see we've pulled together partners from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, from Indigenous Services Canada, as well as partners from National Research Council, who from their coastal engineering group, and community partners from Emergency Management British Columbia, as well as University of Victoria. In addition, we reached out to some of you may be familiar with Ocean Networks Canada, who are a nonprofit group based in Victoria that work really closely with many of our scientists to manage a network of underground sensors on the seafloor. And then bringing together this team, we reached to out to some of you may be familiar with the Defence Research Development Canada has a funding proposal that they put together on a yearly basis called the Canadian Safety and Security Program that helps to support some of these types of research projects. And we were successful in putting together this sorry, I'm just going to advance the it worked really well in the, there we go. We were successfully supported in putting together our proposal, and we now have a 3-year project. We're in year 2 of the project right now that brings together and supports some of this work that we're going to be talking about in this presentation today. So really the key objectives of this work were to develop and demonstrate best practices and tools that can be used for flood risk assessment. And we are using a number of case studies and working really closely with a number of communities across the country to better understand and to demonstrate how we can look at coastal flooding in communities across Canada. So we're going to be focusing on a number of different coastal flooding issues. And I can tell you that we had an opportunity to visit a small remote coastal First Nation community out here on the West Coast. And we went talking to the communities, and the communities, we said we're really concerned about sea level rise and how we can look at the impacts of sea level rise. And the community reached back to us and said, well, you know, we're really not just interested in sea level rise. We wanted to learn about all the coastal flooding issues. So we want to learn about and understand what could impact us from the sea. So things like tsunamis, things like the storms that are coming into our communities and impacting us. And what will that look like, not just now, but in the future as the climate is changing. So we tried to bring a more comprehensive picture and understanding of different various coastal flooding issues. And so we're demonstrating this in a number of different communities, as I mentioned. And so we've selected 3 communities across the various oceans. So in the Pacific Ocean, the community of Boundary Bay, in the Northern Ocean, the community of Tuktoyaktuk in Northwest Territories, and in the Eastern Coast, a region of the Acadia Peninsula in New Brunswick. And so we're using these communities to develop and demonstrate best practices, as I mentioned. And then in these communities, we are generating new hazard information on storms, on sea level rise, and in case of the West Coast, we're also looking at tsunamis. And then we're also working on development of new flood damage modeling tools that can be demonstrated using and how to understand more about what are those quantitative risks that can be assessed in the communities. And finally, we're going to be working really closely. We're working really closely with the communities to understand how the modeling information, the risk assessment information, can inform risk reduction planning and decision making at the community. So ultimately, communities can become more resilient and protect themselves. So what I'm showing right now is a framework that we put together. So I really, thanks to my colleagues. Jackie Yip and colleagues at National Research Council who helped to put this framework together. And this framework, what you're looking at on the screen, the intent is to develop a best practices that can be shared and used across the country. And it aligns really nicely with current guidelines that are out there. So the floodplain mapping framework guidelines that some of you may be familiar with, as well as the current climate change adaptation frameworks that are in place right now. So it's not something that's just a one-off, but it's something that integrates into current systems as well. And as I mentioned, we're using the case studies to test how this guideline can be used, and this approach framework can be used to demonstrate it in the 3 community case studies that I just mentioned in the last slide. So if you look on the left-hand side, the first step, and this has an iterative process, but you can also go back and forth in this process. And what we're looking at right now is the coastal flood risk assessment. But this work will then inform coastal flood risk reduction strategy. So it's a piece of the puzzle, but we're going to really focus on just the flood risk assessment component. So on the left-hand side, we're looking at the first stage is to work really closely with the communities to understand, what really matters to the community. So what are the priorities and concerns, and how do we and start to scope and understand what's important? What are the information gaps that are missing? Is there current information? Is there more information need to be brought to the table? So that's the first stage we're at in terms of prioritizing and setting up what this work can look like and what it will help to inform. So are there risk tolerance thresholds that the community is interested in addressing, and will this inform emergency management planning, or will it form land use planning? So that's what we look at in terms of identifying priority concerns and scope. And then moving into the next stage is the hazard assessment. And this is typically carried out at engineering scale level assessment. So this is how deep, how often will flooding occur, what types of flooding will occur, are we looking at a number of different scenarios, what should those scenarios look like, should we be including a tsunami, should we be including storms, what about sea level rise and coastal erosion, especially in the northern communities, we're looking at impacts to changing permafrost and the impacts of ice. You know, what scales should these studies, these hazard modeling be carried out? So these are the kind of questions that we ask and the types of work that are carried out during the flood hazard assessment. And what we've seen is that in looking at a number of different studies that have been carried around across Canada, there is often confusion between some of this terminology. So we're really trying to be clear about the terminology as used. So this is what flood hazard means. And then moving into the next box, the flood exposure assessment. So this is really, you know, what and who will be affected and to what extent. And this is, we're talking about here is people and buildings and infrastructure. So who and what are located in the area that we're concerned about, that we've identified in our priority setting. So it's starting to build together data sets of buildings, where they are, what types of buildings they are, how many people, how are they being used? So are they residential buildings? Are they commercial, industrial buildings? And how are they being used? So that's our exposure assessment, not to be confused with the next stage, which is a vulnerability assessment. So sometimes this terminology between hazard assessment, exposure assessment, and vulnerability assessment gets confused, as well as risk assessment. So to be clear, the vulnerability assessment helps us to understand how the community will be affected, how the lives of the community and the infrastructure will be affected. So really, this is what are the impacts to the exposure. So what does this look like in terms of service disruption, in terms of health impacts and economic or financial impacts? That's our vulnerability assessment. And then in the final stage, we're looking at evaluating, communicating the risk. So this is where we do the quantitative, using the impact mapping and the vulnerability mapping to look at things like average annual losses, and then to address uncertainties and limitations in quantifying, identifying the risks, and to work really closely with the communities at this stage to understand what information is needed to inform the decision-making by the public. So that's what we think about in terms of the framework. Okay, and then I'm going to step you through the three communities that we talked about. So these are the three community case studies. We're zooming in a little bit more detail into the communities that we're working with. So on the left-hand side, you can see on the Pacific coast is the community of Boundary Bay. So for those of you familiar with the Metro Vancouver region, the Boundary Bay region it's a fairly urban, populated area close to, you know, one of the most densely populated areas in the province of British Columbia. It's a large bay that borders on the Canada-US border, and we're working really closely with the First Nation community, Semiahmoo First Nation, a very small First Nation community situated right along the border of Canada-US. Some work has been done with the municipalities in this area. They have experienced a number of coastal storms in the region in the past, and there's some questions about tsunamis, and so we're going to be doing some tsunami work, and I'll talk a little bit more in detail. So for the remainder of this presentation, I'm going to focus specifically on the West Coast study because there really isn't enough time to dig in deep into all the studies. And then in the North Coast, we're working with the community of Tuktoyaktuk. It's an Inuvialuit hamlet, so it's much smaller remote community. They just built a road into that community recently, so there now is road access to the community, but it's a single road access. It used to be a fly-in only community. They have been experiencing, it's a community that has been experiencing rapid erosion at an accelerated rate. And in some cases, housing has been, people have been moved out of the settled area because of the rapid erosion. Parts of the community are actually falling into the sea. It's a very low-lying community. And of course, the changing permafrost is a huge issue as as foundations are settling and slumping into the changing permafrost. So that's our North Coast community. And then on the East Coast, we're working closely with the province of New Brunswick and reaching out to a nonprofit group, Valores, which is a research group, works closely with the University of Moncton. And we're looking at more of a regional scale approach. So we're looking at a number of very small municipalities, a population of 30,000 people in the Acadian Peninsula. It's a predominantly French-speaking communities. And there has been some extensive work done in the communities, but we're looking at more of a regional scale and bringing together an understanding of what it looks like and means in terms of coastal storms and sea level rise changes for the region as a whole. So let's zoom into the Boundary Bay case study, as I mentioned. This study came about because I was participating in a conference in Halifax a number of years ago, and I was sitting in a session about First Nations issues and emergency management. And as I was sitting in the session, a participant stood up and mentioned that they were really concerned about tsunami issues in their community because they are a community that has been split in half a number of years ago when the U.S.-Canada border was put in place. And as it was put in place, many of their relatives still live across the U.S. border, and they're situated on the Canadian border. But their relatives in the U.S. said that they should be concerned about tsunami issues, and they'd actually talked about putting in a tsunami siren. And the U.S. government has been telling them that they should be prepared for a tsunami. But on the Canadian side, where Semiahmoo First Nation is situated, the Canadian government have been telling them they should not be worried about tsunami, that limited, if any, tsunami flooding would happen in the area. So they were at a state of confusion as what should I believe? Should I believe our relatives on the U.S. side or the Canadian side? So she basically was reaching out and expressing a concern. And I took that, and I hadn't talked to her at the time at the conference, but I took that back to, as we were developing this project, I said, well, it would be really nice to reach out to Semiahmoo First Nation because they had expressed a concern about the lack of knowledge and seeing if we could work, and they would be interested in working together in addressing some of these issues to better understand what coastal flooding should look like. So you can then see, so this is the area a little bit more zoomed up. As I mentioned, it's a urban First Nation urban community, so situated to a lot of infrastructure and many densely populated communities in this lower mainland region. And what I'm showing this map is a map that was put together by the Fraser Basin Council that has been doing some flood modeling work, both coastal and river flood modeling work in the region, and have developed a series of maps. And so we are currently stepping through, so if we're stepping through the processes of the guidelines, which I showed you on the last couple of slides, that first identifies the priorities and concerns and scope. And those are things like, should we be concerned about tsunami? Should we be evacuating? They're a low-lying community, Semiahmoo First Nation. They don't have a lot of area that they can go to high level. And so those are some of the concerns they're addressing. Should we be concerned about rising sea level? What does this look like, and what does this mean to our community? And they're a community that's rapidly undergoing some change right now. They're doing some new planning and development in the community, and a new, for the first time, a water clean water drinking water pipeline is being put into the community. This has been a community that has been on a boil water advisory for many, many years, even though they're in close proximity to a very densely populated area. So that's our identifying the priorities. And then in terms of the flood hazard assessment, we're going to look at a number of different tsunami scenarios, and I'll step you through some of those, as well as storm surge work as well. This community has been, as I mentioned, it's a very shallow bay, and it has been hit by a number of storms in the past. In terms of exposure assessment, we're collecting and gathering information on the types of buildings, what are the assets of concern to the community, who would be impacted, and looking at developing a number of damage functions that would help to inform some of the second stage, the vulnerability assessment, and so we can start to understand how services might be impacted or how people might be impacted. And then in the final stage, we'll be working closely with the communities to evaluate and communicate the risks so it can inform their decision making. Went too many slides, apologize. Okay, so as I mentioned, this is a First Nation community, a very small First Nation community. It's a community that has oral history that dates back to 10,000 years. So really, really rich community in terms of knowledge. The chief, when we first met with the community, the chief talked about oral history that dates back 10,000 years, about these 14 major floods that impacted the Fraser Delta, essentially. And they have records and stories about how they knew one of the big floods was coming into the area, and so they built 2 large canoes, and they took their people, and they took their young people, and they put them in one canoe, and they put all their supplies in a second canoe, and they tied them to the flanks of Mount Baker because they knew that the flood was coming in, and they are the people who survived the flood. So they have this incredibly rich history and understanding. At one time, there were about 250,000 people living in the Boundary Bay region before pre-colonial time, and that, of course, changed as smallpox and diseases came in and impacted the population. Now the population is about 90 people that are part of the Semiahmoo First Nation. But it was really interesting to think about the history of these 14 floods, because these 14 floods align really nicely with geological history. So we're looking at integrating Indigenous and scientific knowledge. The geological history in the area shows these repeated flooding events that come from as the ice was retreating during the Ice Age 10,000 years ago. And as the ice retreated, these glacial dams burst, and each time they burst, this flooding of water would come into the Fraser Delta, bringing with it lots and lots of sediment. And that's hence how the Fraser Delta was built. So the stories from the Semiahmoo First Nation align really nicely with the geological history. And so, given the fact that now currently the Semiahmoo First Nation is concerned about tsunami history, we need to take a warning and listen to this. And we know that coastal First Nation communities up and down the coastline have talked about oral histories of tsunamis that have impacted and inundated many of these communities in the past. So one of the first stages we did in terms of collecting some of the data information gaps was to actually develop an elevation model. So in order to understand and do detailed coastal flood modeling, we need to have a good understanding of what is the elevation both on the land and in the water. So we put together worked together with the communities in the region, as well as Canadian Hydrographic Service and GeoBC, who's collected some and developed some detailed elevation data using LiDAR technology. So we held a workshop in the last fall, that brought together, you can see a photograph of all the people that were brought together. We held these out. This was led by Ocean Networks Canada, with colleagues from NOAA down in the US, as well as community colleagues from the region and government colleagues, to develop, a really, really comprehensive and detailed elevation data. And we were fortunate to be able to collect some. So one of the biggest gaps actually we saw in the elevation, there was really good LiDAR data on the land, but less so on the water areas, especially in those near-shore regions. So we worked closely with the Canadian Hydrographic Service, and they flew some water LiDAR that helped to fill in some of those gaps. So we now have a really good detailed integrated LiDAR model for the region. And this LiDAR model will help to inform some of our tsunami and storm surge modeling that's now currently being carried out right now. So as I mentioned we're going to look at not just one type of tsunami impact, some tsunami modeling, but a number of different tsunamis that can occur and can impact the region, as well as some storm surge scenarios. So I'm going to step through some of these different types of tsunami and storm scenarios, and how this can then, of course, inform the different types of purposes of decision making, whether it's financial decision making, people looking for the worst, potentially could be looking for the worst case scenario, whether it's community planning, whether they're looking for a range of scenarios in terms of where to plan and build infrastructure and buildings, or emergency management and how to evacuate people. So let's start with our first tsunami scenario, which is our distant earthquake. So many of you may be familiar with a large earthquake that happened in 1964, just off the coast of northern part of Alaska. And this impact, so in this case, the community would not have felt, in southwestern British Columbia, would not have felt the ground shaking, but these large series of waves that come in sets would have inundated the communities. And in some cases, off the west coast of Vancouver Island, there were communities that were inundated and caused some severe damage in 1964 to the community. So, for instance, the Port Alberni, which is just off the west coast of Vancouver Island, was impacted in some severe. You'll see a little photograph of flooding and infrastructure that was damaged to that community. So we're looking at distance earthquakes. We're looking at also the near earthquake. So in this case, we're concerned about the large subduction zone earthquake, the so-called big earthquake. And there's a number of different scenarios of how this is the Cascadia subduction zone. And it's a large fault that goes all the way from northern Vancouver Island off the coast of West Coast. It runs sort of the span like the northern Vancouver Island all the way down to northern California. So it's a very, very long fault. We know that it ruptured in the past in 1700, and there's oral history of communities being flooded by a tsunami wave that was impacted coastal communities, as well. Of course, the wave was detected over across the other side of the Pacific Ocean in Japan, this rogue wave that came in without understanding what the earthquake source was. So we're looking at a number of ways that the Cascadia can rupture, and you can see on the top right-hand side a number of different scenarios. So we've got the buried rupture scenario, the splay fault scenario, and the trench breach scenario. We're going to look at how the waves that could generate from these different scenarios, how they might impact the community of Semiahmoo First Nation in terms of a tsunami wave. And then moving to even closer earthquakes, we know that there are a couple of crustal. These are those shallow earthquakes that can happen in the interslab region. So we know that there's a number of crustal faults that have been recently new information has been detected about them. These are shallow faults that are just across the border. There's 3 of them we're going to look, or potentially 2 of them we're going to look at. The Birch Bay Fault, which is just across the border of Boundary Bay, the Sandy Point Fault, and the Skipjack Island Fault Zone as well. The Skipjack Island Fault Zone in particular could cause a landslide that could trigger a tsunami. And we do know that there are paleo tsunami deposits in the Birch Bay, from the Birch Bay region, that could have come, that we're not sure which tsunami it comes from, but which source zone it comes from, but we're going to look at a number of different crustal faults. These, of course, are harder to constrain the parameters on, and it's harder to get the uncertainties on. We don't have the return periods for those, but we will start to build up some information on those. And our colleague, Lucinda Leonard from the University of Victoria, is focusing on the near earthquake crustal faults. And then in addition, we're going to be looking at some of the tsunamis that can be triggered by landslides. So just off the coast, just off the Fraser, at the end of the mouth of the Fraser River, you can see the plume, and those of you who've flown into Vancouver before, you can see the really silty water just off the coast of Vancouver. And that's, of course, from the Fraser River delivers about 17 million tons of sediment a year that accumulate in the Strait at the delta point, and there's a really steep delta slope at the end, and that has failed in the past and actually buried some infrastructure. There's, of course, there are cables that are going across, underwater energy cables that go across to Vancouver Island. We've got a major ferry terminal in that area. We've got port infrastructure. So if we do know that we have done some modeling work has been done to look at underwater slope failure that could trigger a tsunami that would bounce off Galiano and Main Island. And we're going to look at see what that would look like in terms of it reflecting off the islands and going into the Boundary Bay region. So that's another one of our scenarios. And then the other thing that some of you may or may not be familiar with, a kind of a new concept, are meteo tsunamis. So in the past, these were tsunamis that people didn't know what the sources were. And these are tsunamis that are impacted by meteorological changes, so rapid changes in the barometric pressure that can create these tsunamis that can be up to about 1 meter in height. So we're going to look at some of those in the Boundary Bay region as well. And then, of course, as I mentioned, we're going to look at storms. So our colleagues at the Department of Fisheries and Oceans are helping us with some of the developing of these source zones, as well as carrying out the inundation modeling for our inundation propagation modeling for all our tsunamis and storms off the coast. And if this works or not, I have a couple of tsunami inundation models that were created in the past by Ocean Networks Canada. I'm going to try and run these. And whoops. this may or may not work, but this, you can see some of these models there. They show you the time changes as the waves are coming into the coastal inland regions, and what does that look like in terms of the heights of the waves, and what does that mean in terms of, these are some of the types of coastal model, the inundation modelings that can be developed, and then even closer up. So you can see this is from the Cascadia earthquake that happened in 1700, and what that would look like presently in terms of inundating communities. So this is, I'm now running the inundation model for the a more zoomed in region for the Port of Alberta. You can see, you know, after about 45 minutes that the wave comes into the Port Alberni, and of course this is a wave that gets, it extends up this really, really narrow channel about 150 kilometers away from the actual coastline, but it's a very steep walled channel, and as the wave is traveling down this steep walled channel, it acts kind of like a bathtub effect. You know, when you sit in a bathtub and you watch the waves get big, water gets higher and higher and higher. It creates this higher wave that gets channeled as it goes down the long inlet down to Port Alberni. So that is a quick snapshot of what some of these models will look like. And then, you know, you can develop models, but it's important to understand, will these or have these types of inundation scenarios actually happen in the community? So we have been, and we have done some work already to visit the communities in Semiahmoo First Nation, and we do what's called Paleo tsunami work, and you can see some photographs of how we dug into some of the nearshore areas to look and see if we could find records of sand deposits that have been washed up from the actual historic waves. It's what we found, though. Right now we haven't actually found paleo tsunami deposits yet at this time, but we have seen that because we've seen that the area is very highly disturbed in terms of lots of infrastructure and changes that happened upriver from this area right here, located in Little Campbell River, just up above Semiahmoo First Nation. You know, there's a lot of agriculture runoff and change that brings in and changes. So we're going to go back again and look a little bit closer and look a little bit deeper to see if we can find any records of tsunamis. But we do know that there have been quite a number of shell middens, which is that have been detected in Boundary Bay. Shell middens are how the local Indigenous people buried their ancestors in the past, and so shell middens have many shell middens have been discovered in the Boundary Bay region, and you can see on the right-hand side some of the records of the shell middens. And now moving into our next phase, we've gone from the hazard assessment, we're moving into the exposure assessment. We are developing and currently developing a building scale level assessment, but of where people and buildings are in the region to better understand who and what can be impacted. And these, so you can see from this map region for the Lower Mainland region that the color in the light blue region in the Boundary Bay area, it's urban, low-density population, so mostly smaller houses, a little bit of mixed commercial industrial, but less dense, say, than in the downtown Vancouver area. And then we'll start to get a better picture once we understand what kind of critical infrastructure is going through the area. So, for instance, we know there's a large 500 kV electrical power transmission line that crosses the Canada-US border that's really close to the region. There's a rail line that goes along the Boundary Bay region for the BSN that travels across Canada-US and carries lots of coal and other goods and goods across the border. So we do know that's an area that has quite a bit of infrastructure, and of course there's cultural significant features in the area that are very important to the Semiahmoo First Nation. And then in terms of moving to our next box of the guideline is the vulnerability assessments. As I mentioned earlier, we are working on developing and working closely with other colleagues, including those at the Fraser Basin Council and consulting company based out of Alberta, the IBI group, to look at an open source flood risk modeling application to be able to test and demonstrate how we can quantitatively assess what are both the direct impacts and some of the indirect impacts that the community will suffer. And then once we've collected and compiled this information, we're then looking at communicating and validating the results. So these are working closely with the community to see how it can help inform their planning processes. The last thing I want to mention before we go back out to reach out to you guys on the call, so you've heard enough of me talking, but I also want to let you know that we are holding a symposium in June, later in June, that will bring together some of these partners who are involved in this project through a symposium called the Understanding Risk Forum that's going to happen in the Lower Mainland area of Vancouver and the West Coast. And the intent is to bring together and to share knowledge between the research community and those who need to use that information, so the practitioners, to help inform their decision making. So that's going to be happening in June. And now what I want to do, you've heard enough of me talking, so I'm going to pass it over to, we're going to be running a poll, and I'm going to read out the questions in the poll, and then Tracy is going to set up a poll and ask you to respond to some of these questions. So take a look on the screen. I want to hear back from you guys in the audience to understand what's important to you, so that the guidelines that we're developing can actually be useful to people like you, and make sure that we're addressing the right types of questions. So Tracy has just put up a poll on the screen, so I'll just read through the questions and we'll give you a couple minutes to answer them. And then Sophie is also on the call. She's going to read back any questions if you guys choose the other option. You can add your comments to the Q&A box in the bottom hand corner. She will read those back. So let's go through the questions. So what we're looking at, what option best reflects your interest in coastal flooding? So basically, I'm trying to find out who you are. So if you can select your questions, I'm going to give you another couple seconds to answer these questions. So whether you're involved in the insurance industry and you're looking to better, for instance, to better understand what are the costs associated with coastal flooding, whether you're an engineer working closely with the community to do an informed design of new and existing infrastructure, or whether you're a land use planner who's looking at developing, for instance, land use plans like where subdivisions should be put in place or not, whether you are an emergency manager and you develop emergency plans for how communities can safely evacuate, or whether you're a researcher or an academic looking to better understand the latest innovation in coastal flooding modeling. So with that, I'm going to close the panel. And I'm going to reach out to Tracy. Tracy, if you can close the panel, we're going to see the results on the line. So what we've seen is really interesting results. So we've got people from the engineering community, we've got lots of researchers, and we've got emergency managers, and we've got some others that are also involved. So Sophie, if I can reach out to you to read a couple of the other comments.
For sure.
I don't know how many there are, but if we can read a couple of them, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So as of now, we have 4 others, 5, 6. Sorry. So yeah, meteorologist who works with emergency managers in advance of heavy rain events, storm surge, and act as a resource in climate adaptation and mitigation. We have someone that works on the impact to marine transportation. Someone that works with the Western Transportation Network and is looking to better understand how coastal flooding will affect our supply chains and communities as a whole. Someone else responded that she works in coastal adaptation at an environmental charity. We have students in planning. We have government representatives that work in alert development, and policy analysts at Transport Canada interested in how coastal flooding may affect transportation networks and infrastructure. More specifically, for example, the impacts on ports, terminals, bridges, and we also have an environmental performance office for Halifax. So very wide, diverse audience.
Wow, that's very exciting. Wow, there's a lot of expertise in this audience. Really excited to hear. Okay, well, let's move to our next poll. Okay, so I'll get Tracy to put up the poll number 2. So here we're looking at the type of information you're looking for. So, you know, I really see this, and I'm really excited to see ICLR put together this working group to share information and to bring together a community of practice. So that's why we thought we'd experiment and try to do a poll. So again, you can take a look at the poll, same style of format. So we're going to look at the type of information that you are looking for and that will be interest to your coastal flooding. So same thing, I'm involved in the insurance industry, for instance, and I'm looking to better understand the costs associated with flooding. I think, is this the right? I think this is, Tracy, this might be poll number 1 as well. I'm not sure if you can go to poll number 2. This seems to be our first poll that we've already carried out already. Okay, but I'll read the questions while Tracy's setting that up so you can take a look at this. So we're looking at the type of information you're looking for. There we go. So for instance, I'm in the insurance industry, and it sounds like there's no one from the insurance industry, but we're looking for average annual costs. For instance, I'm an engineer looking at and to better understand what types of coastal scenarios I should be using to inform design. I'm a land use planner looking to better understand what kind of, again, what kind of scenarios, whether I'm looking at current scenarios or future scenarios, so I can inform future design of new communities. I'm an emergency manager, and I'm looking to understand how I can safely evacuate, where we can evacuate to, and what parts of roads or transportation systems might be impacted from flooding during a storm, so we know how to set up evacuation routes and get people to safely as quickly as possible. Or I'm a researcher looking at getting access to and contributing, and how do I contribute to the latest research on coastal flood modeling or others, again, in the QA box. So if I can then reach it out to Tracy to show the results of that poll. Okay, interesting, let's see. So again, 21% are in the engineers community looking for different types of, interested in different types of scenarios. Again, we have some people in the emergency management side looking for how to evacuate communities and get them to safety, and figure out what roads and where we can put disaster response routes. And some researchers as well, 29% of them are researchers. And I'm going to pass it over to you, Sophie, to read the what we have in the Q&A box.
Yes, absolutely. So we have, again, someone from government looking to identify vulnerabilities and leverage, and leverage framework for alerting. Someone that's looking to better understand how to inform members of her organization about how to adapt their work in the supply chain to tackle coastal flooding accordingly. Someone a little bit different looking to develop 3D LiDAR modeling. Someone that is interested in maps models that shows what will and won't be flooded by coastal flooding, more specifically, where are the highest risks. And she's also interested in collaborations to inform Transport Canada's decision making. We have someone from the research community who is interested in knowledge transfer to coastal communities about the compound effects of sea level rise and storm surges, and someone that's just more broadly looking to identify risk as well.
Thank you. Sounds like you've got some, Sophie, some good suggestions for your next speakers in your series. Could come out of that. Yes. Okay, let's move to poll number 3. It's a poll number 3, and so if I can get Tracy to put up poll number 3, and I'll read them out to you as she's putting them up. So, perfect. Okay, so here we're looking at the different types of coastal scenarios. So we're going to zoom into coastal scenarios. We talked about the number of different tsunami scenarios. We talked about the storm scenarios. So now we're getting a better sense of what you're looking at in terms of scenarios. I can tell you with the community so far, and with the research group, we've had a lot of back and forth. Well, what can we model? What can't we model? What should be included? What's in? What's out? And so I think what we're trying to really understand is what's important to the different types of users. So I will skip the insurance one because it sounds like there's no one for the insurance. But again, we've got the engineering box. So we've got what types of and ranges of scenarios that you're working with. And the following question will look in a little bit more detail about the types of scenarios that could be included. So if you just select which box and then again, we've got the land use planning community. They're looking for current and future storms, potentially. Those are the different types of scenarios. And then the emergency managers were looking for potentially worst case scenarios or not. Maybe there's other types of scenarios you're looking for emergency planning. So I'd love to hear from you in the Q&A box if there's other types of scenarios that are not here. These are just a sample. I just wanted to get into some of the discussions about what's important to you and how you can use some of these scenarios. Or I'm a researcher and I'm potentially looking at developing a probabilistic approach to scenario modeling or Q&A. So again, if you can, we're going to close the poll now, and then we'll take a look at some of the findings from that poll. So Tracy, if I'll reach it back to you to close terminate our poll. And what we see from the engineering community, yes, you're looking at developing, you need to looking to understand a number of range of scenarios, as well as the emergency management community, looking at worst case scenarios. So we may hear from the Q&A box other types of scenarios that emergency managers are looking for, and potentially researchers are looking at probabilistic approaches. So what I'll do is I'll reach it back out to Sophie again, if you can read from the Q&A box to get a better sense of what our people in our audience are looking for, the types of scenarios.
Yeah, absolutely. And once again, we have a variety of responses, which is great, and I hope it's helpful to you as well. So the first person that responded mentioned he's interested in storm-driven coastal flooding risk. We have someone else that's interested in getting a better understanding of the scale of risks involved and how challenging it will be to mitigate them. We have someone that's in research, but who is also interested in the implications for insurance and what would also that mean for municipal tax implications. And finally, someone else that mentioned being interested in a range of scenarios by probability and risk level. And sorry, we have another one that just showed up. User interactive SLR and storm surge levels.
Okay, thank you. Interesting. Okay, and then let's move to, we've got our last poll. So I'll get Tracy to set up the last poll. So these are so what I've put together is a question about the types of different scenarios that we're looking for. So and I know I'm just putting these up because these are some of the discussions we're having with our own research group right now as we're working through the case studies. So what types of coastal scenarios will help, and are you looking to inform your work? So this is something we want to capture in the guideline, is to understand the types of scenarios that you're looking for in terms of, are you including a range of tides for storms, high tide, mean tide, low tide, or a whole bunch of tides? What are you looking at in terms of sea level rise, or what types of sea level rise scenarios are you looking at? The latest IPCC scenarios using the worst case RCP 8.3. Is that the scenario you're using? Are you using best practices guidelines? So for instance, I know in British Columbia, there's the Senko-Sanwell best practice guideline looks at 1 meter sea level rise for the coast, British Columbia coast for the year 2100. And are you looking at current year sea level rise? You're looking at a range of different years. What are you looking at? So some of these, if you can also put, I didn't put a last option, but if you're selecting some of those sea level rises, and then any additional comments you have about some of those scenarios in the Q&A box. And then if you're addressing tsunamis, are you addressing a range of different tsunamis, local, distant, local and distant earthquakes, landslide sources, and meteo tsunamis? And lastly, are you looking at a range of different recurrence periods, and what might some of those look like? So with that, we'll close the poll and see if Tracy can put up the results from the poll. Okay, this should be interesting. So yes, you're looking, 33% of you are looking at a range of different tide levels. So interesting to hear. I'd love to hear more about the different tide level ranges you're thinking about using in the scenarios. And then for addressing sea level rise, again, you're looking at a number of different scenarios. So I'd love to hear more about the types of scenarios that are important to you for sea level rise. Some of you, 10% are looking at a range of tsunami scenarios, and then 10% as well looking at a range of recurrence periods. So these are recurrence periods for storms and things that we're looking at. So yeah, if we can pass it over to Sophie to look at what is in the Q&A box and get a sense of any more discussions that have come from looking at the various types of coastal scenarios.
Yeah, absolutely. So far, we just have 2 people that mentioned being interested in all of the above. So everything that you listed being of high interest to them. And we have someone else suggesting photorealistic 3D modeling as an interesting tool for his work.
Huh, okay, interesting. Okay, great. No, yeah, great. Really interesting discussion. Okay, and then I'm gonna, so really, that was our last slide of the polls, and I'm at the end of my PowerPoint presentation. So now I'm just gonna reach it back to you for any other further questions that you may have had on some of the slides that we looked and talked about. I can go back to some of the slides if you want to look and talk about them in a little bit more detail, or if there's other discussions about coastal flooding that concerns you or that is of interest to you, that may be of interest to the others in the group. So, you know, I was really interested in issues like disruption to supply chain for transportation networks. That sounds really interesting because, you know, we can't do this by ourselves, but together as a group and as a community of practice, we can really start to help answer some of these questions. And, you know, so I'm really reaching back to you now to any other questions you might have. And I may not be able to answer these. Some other yous may have more expertise in other parts of this field than I do. So if others have answers to some of the questions in the Q&A, welcome your comments as well. So I'll reach back to Sophie again to see if there's any questions or comments in the Q&A box.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Nikki. This was a great presentation, and I'm sure it was of very high interest to everyone in our audience. I'd like to, before I start with the questions, I'd like to ask everyone who's online to write down your questions in the question box so I can make sure to get to them as I discuss with Nikki in the next couple minutes. First of all, Nikki, I was wondering, you mentioned in the beginning having worked very closely with communities in the East Coast and the West Coast, in the North. Would you say from your experience with your discussions with emergency managers and everyone that the communities share very similar concerns among them in terms of their risks and exposure, or would you say you saw some great variability in their maybe even risk perceptions or the risk per se between the three different coasts?
That's a really good question, Sophie. And what we've seen so far is that some things are similar, but some things are extremely different across the communities and the range of communities. So that's why I'm really glad that we were able, you know, when we're able to work with three different communities. I mean, there could be a variety of different ways of even, you know, better understanding what other communities are addressing too that we cannot address in these three case studies. But yeah, so the issues in the northern part of Canada can and are very different than some of the issues in Western Canada. I mean, they're experiencing accelerated changes in the north. You know, the climate, the temperature changing is much rapid, and the changes are happening at much quicker rate. And in some cases, they're already moving people out of the areas that are impacted by coastal flooding already, and they're having to address it right now. So some things are quite urgent. In the Eastern case study, we're looking at instead of a more zooming into a detailed community, we're kind of trying to get a regional approach. So it's kind of more of what a province will be looking at in terms of understanding what are the concerns for emergency managers and planning. So the scale is really important. And what we also see is that in smaller communities, the emergency manager or the land use planner is wearing multiple hats and they're making multiple decisions. So in many cases, they're having to, you know, they don't have the capabilities or resources to bring in all the necessary expertise, and they're working on a different types of budget or scale to be able to do this type of work, or they're contracting out, and some of the contractors they're bringing in are not local to the communities, are not necessarily as aware of the local issues. So that's why it's stressing the importance of community engagement and working really closely to understand what's important to the communities, so that the work you do does inform the community work is what we've seen is really critical. So those are some of the things that we've seen already. But yeah, and then of course in our West Coast community, it's an urban community, and an urban community with a lot of infrastructure going through the area. And there's a lot of reliance on what other communities or municipalities are doing nearby, and how one community can affect another community. So making sure that communities work together. Those are just some of the things that we've seen, but yeah, welcome comments from others who've seen some of the differences to coastal flooding across Canada. So back to you.
Great. Thank you,
Sophie.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. And building on that, you mentioned the involvement of communities. You also briefly mentioned risks faced by certain either infrastructure provider or I think it was a railroad that you said was at risk in one of your Western communities earlier in the presentation. In the discussions that you're having, are you also including, I know we have on the line several people from transportation infrastructure, so are you also including on the private sector infrastructure provider, transportation providers in the discussions that you're having?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point, Sophie. So right now we're working closely with the communities. We have been reaching out to critical infrastructure owners in the we have another project that's also happening, not just on coastal flooding, but looking at earthquake hazards, and working closely with the Fraser Basin Council. And we're working to compile and start to understand some of the impacts from critical infrastructure and in some of the interdependencies that are associated with critical infrastructure. So, you know, that's why things like the Understanding Risk Symposium, which I mentioned before we got into the polls, is a good opportunity to start to bring in some of the different partners and to better understand what are the concerns of the private sector, like rail and other transportation networks or other utilities and those who are also involved in the critical infrastructure sector. So yeah, and so very important. But so welcome up those opportunities, like things like the Understanding Risk Symposium, where we can start to talk about impacts that go beyond just a community, but go for widespread regions. Yeah. So back to you, Sophie.
Oh, wonderful. And I'm sure a lot of our participants will be interested in participating. We've received a couple questions around risk communication, I would say. So some people online are wondering what would you think are the best strategies to go around public awareness and communication of coastal flood risk? And also, what would you think would be the best way to inform business, community and government leaders so they better understand the risks involved with coastal flooding? And I think this person had a specific interest with the Lower Mainland in BC.
Okay, yeah, that's an interesting question, yes. So at this point, as I mentioned, we're working closely with the communities, but the communities already are connected very closely with their public and the people who live in their communities. So the intent is that the communities, once they have a better understanding of what they're facing both now and in the future from coastal flooding, that they can start to develop some strategies to be able to. That's why it's really important that that communication piece is put together so that you know, as communities are reaching out to their public and the people who live in the region, that they understand some of those pieces of awareness. I can tell you that we're also developing a risk platform right now. We're in early stages of developing that risk platform, and the risk platform will be a way to share some of the research work that we've been analyzing and collecting and compiling, and to share that in conjunction with the community, so that can then be shared. And that, of course, is public and open and accessible. But ultimately, it's the communities that work closely with the people who live in their neighborhood. And so we want to work closely with the local governments and the people who work in the communities to better understand first. And then they can reach out to each one of their individual members as needed, or, you know, when issues happen. So, yeah, back to you on that, Tracy. Hopefully that's, yeah.
Yes, no, that's great. Thank you very much.
Sophie.
We have someone that's interested in hearing more about the main conclusions from the work you did, but on the East Coast, so in the Acadian Peninsula. Would you be able to talk a little bit about this?
Okay, so I can tell you on the, yeah, thank you for that question. On the East Coast, we're just starting our work in the East Coast and engaging, and we're hoping to set up, we're planning to set up a workshop in the Acadian Peninsula with the province and with Valoris. We're in early stages right now just to set up those workshops, and we've done some preliminary modeling right now, downscaling some of the regional hazard models, and we're in the process of doing some data scoping, and we will be visiting the communities in this March, to get a better understanding of some of the concerns from the communities, and to work with those who have already done some work in some of the hazard and risk assessment. So we're still, as I mentioned, in early stages, and if you're involved or interested in work in the East Study, I'd welcome if you reach out to me, and I'd love to connect with you further, because I'm sure that there's some great expertise within our group here. But yeah, so that's where we are right now in our East Coast study.
Okay, so perfect. Thank you so much. Yeah, so I have a little bit more technical questions. Before I go into them, I'd like to invite anyone else on the line who has more questions to type them in. So I have a few questions, but just to give you a chance to type them. Two people are inquiring about making the data that you have public. So will you be making the LIDAR DEM data public or otherwise available to other researchers? And someone else wondering if there are any GIS maps that can be shared that show the potential impact of tsunami based on scenarios to BC's coastline. So two different questions, but both about data sharing. So.
Okay, let's start with the DEM one first. So the DEM, as I mentioned, it was a collaborative effort. The data sets came from a number of different sources, and working on an MOU and data sharing agreements with the province and with Canadian Hydrographic Service to be able to make that data more widely accessible. So we won't share the original source inputs. That doesn't belong to us. That belongs to the people who actually collect and compile that data, but we are looking to share the final integrated elevation model for the region that was developed. So but we can't release it until we have those MOU and data sharing agreements in place. So once those are in place, then we will make it available. But it will be the product that has been the integrated product, not the initial input data. That's not ours to share. But yes, looking forward to that. And I know that there's a number of people who are interested in using that data set for a variety of different purposes, which is great. Things like the Living Dike work that's going underway in the Boundary Bay region. I know that they're looking at using that the elevation data set. And I think there were some people doing some bird surveys. There's some other work as well in the region. So for sure, yeah, that has, once we're able to share that data, it's great to see that put to many uses. The second question in terms of GIS layers. So as I mentioned, we are developing a risk platform, and the risk platform will be a way to share maps and outputs. So we're in early stages right now to develop that platform, and the intent is to link that platform to other groups like the provinces and territories who are also sharing directly with their own communities and their own municipalities. So it will be integrated. That's the intent. So it's underway right now, but we're not there yet to share it. We're working on lots of different pieces to be able to share the results of this work as it gets developed. Yeah. So thank you, Sophie. I hope that addresses the questions that have been asked.
Sure. No. So we have one last question, and again, if anyone else online has remaining questions, please type them up right now. So this was a great presentation, very insightful, and to see where this is taking you next in terms of more work with communities, informing risk, involving more people in the discussion. This is all great. On your end, for NRCan, are there further research that you're aiming to do for next steps of this project in the next months or years? Where do you think this will take you next?
That's what I always ask myself all the time. So yeah, that's a great question. And of course, as I mentioned, it took us about a year to put this proposal together, and we were successful in getting it funded. And I've always seen this proposal as a sort of a seed money to move this to the next stage. And of course, my vision and dream is to be able to take this nationally and to start to develop a national understanding and awareness. But we're not yet there yet. We don't have the money or the resources, all the people yet in place to be able to do that. But that's always been a dream of mine, and I'm just going to keep pushing that forward as I can in my place. But it's something that we can't do alone. And as I recognize that we needed to pull together other federal departments that are also working on this. So I know that, for instance, Environment Climate Change Canada is working on a coastal flood forecasting work. So there's other groups that are very much involved in this field, and it's a matter of bringing it together. But that's my vision, and I'm hoping that this community of practice, Sophie, that you've developed can also help to keep the discussion alive and share work. And the intent is to make the guidelines, the best practices, as a starting point to share a standardized approach that can be used across the country, so that we can talk about things like scenarios. What scenarios are people using? What types of outputs are useful to the decision makers? And making sure that the work that gets carried out becomes accessible and available, and how it gets combined and put together. So that's definitely where I'd like to go. We don't yet have funding and money and agreements in place to be able to create a national coastal assessment model yet, but that is my dream, is to take it to that level at the national scale. So yeah, back to you, Sophie.
Great. Yeah, that would be wonderful, and I think everyone online would love that as well. So as you were responding to this last question, we got another final question online. So, of course, this is a lot of great advance and great work in terms of coastal flooding. The question we had online, the person was wondering if you or any other groups are also taking into account riverine flooding, in the context that you're studying right now.
In the coastal part of the... The river for the case studies. Okay, I'm assuming that's river flooding for the case studies.
Yes.
Yes. And so let's talk about the West Coast study first, because there is a river that comes into, that's the Little Campbell River, and we're just looking at, we don't have additional resources to model the river or the river flooding at this point, and I understand that there was a study done in by one of the municipalities in the region that has carried out some detailed flood modeling for the other rivers, the Michilimackinac and the Serpentine River, but not so for the Little Campbell River. But it is an important question. We don't have the resources right now to be able to carry out that work, but it is a gap to be able to address that, and it's an important piece is to understand what river flooding can mean to communities as well. But yeah, I mean, I welcome others who are involved in this piece. The intent is that the guidelines, of course, could be used in a similar approach for flood risk assessment. You know, this is a piece of the puzzle, but not all of the puzzle, and we'll get there eventually. But yeah, we don't have the resources yet to carry out additional flood hazard modeling for the rivers as well. But there are some initiatives underway with other parts of NRCan that are looking at inland, so the rivers across Canada. But I think they're at early stages, some of the flood hazard modeling. And right now, I understand that the flood hazard modeling is carried out by a range of different jurisdictions, from local communities and municipalities to, in some cases, provincial, and in some cases, federal. So it's there's not yet a fully comprehensive standardized flood hazard model for all the rivers across Canada, but there are some changes currently underway that are happening in the government. I can tell you that much. Yeah, so back to you, Sophie.
Okay, great. Thank you. We actually got another question while you were responding to this one. This might be our final one. More specific, do you have more information on the Living Dykes project that you mentioned in Boundary Bay?
I'm not directly involved in the Living Dyke. I hear little snippets here and there, but really some of my colleagues at NRCan are involved in the Living Dyke project, and really you would want to reach out to the City of Surrey. The City of Surrey's, I believe, I'm not sure if they're leading it, but they're heavily involved in the Living Dyke project, and I know it's underway right now, so I can't tell you a lot about it. I just can tell you that the integrated elevation model, of course, is of interest to the Living Dyke model. But yeah, that, of course, the City of Surrey is the one I would reach out to if you want to know more about that project. Yeah. So back to you, Sophie.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So I think this concludes the discussion for today. So thank you again so much, Nicky. This was a great presentation, and I can tell from the participation and the questions that everyone took great interest in it. So thank you so much. I think this was particularly interesting for the type of community of practice that we have. So I just want to offer you, do you have any final thoughts or comments that you'd like to share with the group before I move this to a close?
I just really want to say thank you, everybody, for the really rich discussion, and I look forward to further discussions with you and to this community of practice continuing and being as rich as it has. So thank you again to Sophie and Tracy and all the participants that are on in the discussion.
Thank you so much, Nicky. And I will be in touch through our mailing list and LinkedIn group in the next couple of days to inform you of our next webinar. It hasn't been fully confirmed yet, so I don't want to say anything yet, but I will be in touch very shortly. And I'd like to thank everyone for making the time to attend today. This was, as Nicky said, a very rich discussion, and we're very much looking forward to the next webinar. So stay tuned, and thank you very much. Have a great afternoon.